Hi everyone, I'm Canadian journalist and opinion columnist Adam Zivo. Now, some of you may have heard that Ontario Premier Doug Ford recently blasted Canada's judiciary. Ford argued that some provincial judges are too soft on crime and too eager to engage in judicial activism that undermines his democratic mandate. He suggested that this problem could be fixed by adopting a US-style system where judges are elected, not politically appointed. In response, critics have claimed that his comments undermine judicial independence and that electing judges would be a terrible idea. Their position is not unreasonable, because when judges are beholden to the interests of donors and political supporters, that inevitably increases the risk of biased rulings. In the United States, for example, special interest groups sometimes spend millions of dollars installing judges who support their causes. Worse yet, some judicial elections have devolved into nakedly partisan affairs. Both of these problems naturally undermine the public's faith in the law, so it's unclear why Canada should adopt such a system, especially if doing so requires a messy rewrite of the Constitution. This doesn't mean that the current system is perfect. As of now, the federal government appoints every judge who works in either the federal courts or the upper-level provincial courts. While these appointments should, ideally, be politically neutral, in practice, they are often not. Over time, it's possible for a federal government to stack these courts with ideological allies, leaving no democratic recourse, which is seemingly what has happened under 10 years of liberal rule. And so, while Ford is wrong to advocate for judicial elections, he is right to a certain degree in his diagnosis of the status quo. Our judges are too ideological and they do not reliably represent the public's interests. That being said, there are some important caveats to keep in mind. Ford argues that judges grant bail too easily and are unwilling to impose harsh sentences upon violent or repeat criminals. He says that this has created a broken catch-and-release justice system that fails to keep the public safe. That's a fair criticism, but not one that should be fully absorbed by the judiciary. Yes, some politically appointed judges fail to take crime seriously, but bail and sentencing norms are strongly influenced by federal law. The Liberals, unfortunately, passed several pieces of legislation that reduced sentencing requirements and made bail incredibly accessible for dangerous criminals. So if Ford has a problem with the justice system in this respect, he should lodge his complaints with Prime Minister Mark Carney, not the courts. But the situation is different when it comes to judicial overreach and interference into Ford's democratic agenda. That's because, in recent years, there has been a troubling rise in court rulings that use specious charter arguments to intrude upon policy debates that should, ideally, be resolved in a democratic arena. For example, in early 2024, the BC Supreme Court ruled on a temporary basis that the province cannot prohibit public drug use unless every addict has access to an overdose prevention site. The presiding judge, Chief Justice Christopher Hinkson, seemed eager to use flimsy evidence to invent this charter right out of nowhere. Similarly, late last year, Ontario Superior Court Judge Michael Valente questionably determined that municipalities cannot clear out homeless encampments unless they provide shelter spaces where open drug use is permitted. Now, the rulings seem designed to coerce municipal governments into dramatically changing how their homeless shelters operate, without democratic buy-in, even though the judge had no real mandate to impose such changes. Valente's ruling was later indirectly criticized by another Ontario Superior Court judge, James Ramsay, who, upon ruling on a similar case, noted that such issues are best determined by voters and that micromanagement by judges will not be productive. When the Ford government passed legislation to tier out some of Toronto's bike lanes late last year, they were thwarted by yet another Ontario Superior Court judge, Paul Chabas, who determined that this April that cyclists may have a charter right to such infrastructure. Regardless of how one feels about cycling, and I say this as an avid biker, it seems far-fetched to imagine that access to bike lanes should be guaranteed as a fundamental right. Here's the problem. Canada's courts are supposed to respect the separation of powers lest they usurp the authority of parliaments and the provincial legislatures. But when judges use fabricated charter rights to unilaterally impose open drug use in bike lanes, regardless of voter preferences, That respect seems to be missing. So while it's true that we probably shouldn't elect our judges, because that probably wouldn't fix anything and could just make the situation worse, it is also true that there is something terribly wrong with the current system. In this way, Ford is half right about this issue. That's my take on things, but if you disagree, feel free to drop a comment explaining why. Thanks for joining me today, and make sure you like this video and hit the subscribe or follow button depending on what platform you're on. Until next time, I'm Adam Zivo.